Welcome to the Allegro Music Podcast, where music isn't just music, and the ordinary is extraordinary. We'll bring you musicians and artists from all over, from Los Angeles to San Diego to Hemet to Seattle to Akron to Farmington to New Bedford. We'll bring it to you. Just sit back, relax, and let it happen. On today's Allegro Music Podcast, we'll bring you part 2 of the Charles Dickens Christmas Classic, A Christmas Carol, performed by the Inland Stage Company. So sit back, relax, and let us bring it to you.
Stave 3, the second of the three spirits.
Awakening in the middle of a prodigiously tough snore, and sitting up in bed to get his thoughts together, Scrooge had no occasion to be told that the bell was again upon the stroke of 1. He felt that he was restored to consciousness in the right nick of time, for the special purpose of holding a conference with a second messenger dispatched to him through Jacob Marley's intervention. But finding that he turned uncomfortably cold when he began to wonder which of his curtains this new spectre would draw back, he put them every one aside with his own hands, and laying down again, established a sharp lookout all around the bed, for he wished to challenge the spirit on the moment of its appearance, and did not wish to be taken by surprise and made nervous.
Gentlemen of the free and easy sort, who plume themselves on being acquainted with a move or two, and being usually equal to the time of day, express the wide range of their capacity for adventure by observing that they are good for anything from pitch and toss to manslaughter, between which opposite extremes, no doubt, there lies a tolerably wide and comprehensive range of subjects. Without venturing for Scrooge quite as heartily as this, I don't mind calling on to you to believe that he was ready for a good broad field of strange appearances, and that nothing between a baby and a rhinoceros would have astonished him very much.
Now, being prepared for almost anything, he was not by any means prepared for nothing, and consequently, when the bell struck 1 and no shape appeared, he was taken with a violent fit of trembling. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, a quarter of an hour went by, yet nothing came. At last, however, he began to think, as you or I would have thought at first, for it has always been the person not in the predicament who knows what ought to have been done in it, and would unquestionably have done it too. At last, I say, he began to think that the source and the secret of this ghost light might be in the adjoining room, from whence, on further tracing it, it seemed to shine. This idea, taking full possession of his mind, he got up softly, and shuffled in his slippers to the door.
The moment Scrooge's hand was on the lock, a strange voice called him by his name, and bade him enter. He obeyed.
It was his own room. There was no doubt about that, but it had undergone a surprising transformation. The walls and the ceilings were so hung with living green that it looked like a perfect grove, from every part of which bright, gleaming berries glistened. The crisp leaves of holly, mistletoe, and ivy reflected back the light, as if so many little mirrors had been scattered there, and such a mighty blaze went roaring up the chimney as that dull petrifaction of a hearth had never known in Scrooge's time, or Marley's, or for many and many a winter season gone. Heaped upon the floor, to form a kind of throne, were turkeys, geese, game, poultry, brawn, great joints of meat, sucking pigs, long wreaths of sausages, mince pies, plum puddings, barrels of oysters, hot red chestnuts, cherry-cheeked apples, juicy oranges, luscious pears, immense twelfth cakes, and seething bowls of punch that made the chamber dim with their delicious steam. In easy state upon this couch there sat a jolly giant, glorious to see, who bore a glowing torch, in shape not unlike Plenty's horn, and held it up, high, to shed its light on Scrooge as he came peeping round the door.
Come in! Come in and know me better, man.
Scrooge entered timidly, and hung his head before this spirit. He was not the dogged Scrooge he had been, and though the spirit's eyes were clear and kind, he did not like to meet them.
I am the ghost of Christmas present. Look upon me.
Scrooge reverently did so. It was clothed in one simple green robe, or mantle, bordered with white fur. This garment hung so loosely on the figure that its capacious breed was bare, as if disdaining to be warded or concealed by an artifice. Its feet, observable beneath the ample folds of the garment, were also bare, and on its head it wore no other covering than a holly wreath, set here and there with shining icicles. Its dark brown curls were long and free as its genial face, its sparkling eyes, its open hand, its cheery voice, its unconstrained demeanor, and its joyful air. Girded round its middle was an antique scabbard, but no sword was in it, and the ancient sheath was eaten up with rust.
You have never seen the likes of me before?
Never.
Have never walked forth with my younger members of my family? Meaning, for I am very young, my elder brothers, born in these later years?
I don't think I have. I'm afraid I have not. Have you many brothers, Spirit?
More than 1,800.
A tremendous family to provide for, Spirit. Spirit, conduct me where you will. I went forth last night on compulsion, and I learned a lesson which is working on me now. Tonight, if you have aught to teach me, let me profit by it.
Touch my robe.
Scrooge did as he was told, and held it fast.
Holly, mistletoe, red berries, ivy, turkeys, geese, game, poultry, brawn, meat, pigs, sausages, oysters, pies, puddings, fruit, and punch all vanished instantly. So did the room, the fire, the ruddy glow, the hour of night, and they stood in the city streets on Christmas morning, where, for the weather was severe, the people made a rough but brisk and not unpleasant kind of music in scraping the snow from the pavement in front of their dwellings, and from the tops of their houses, whence it was mad delight to the boys to see it come plumping down into the road below and splitting into artificial little snowstorms.
The house fronts looked black enough, and the windows blacker, contrasting with the smooth white sheet of snow upon the roofs, and with the dirtier snow upon the ground, which last deposit had been ploughed up in deep furrows by the heavy wheels of the carts and wagons, furrows that crossed and recrossed each other hundreds of times, where the great streets branched off and made intricate channels, hard to trace in the thick yellow mud and icy water. The sky was gloomy, and the shortest streets were choked up with dingy mist, half thawed, half frozen, whose heavier particles descended in shower of sooty atoms, as if all the chimneys in Great Britain had, by one consent, caught fire and were blazing away to their dear hearts' content. There was nothing very cheerful in the climate or the town, and yet was there an air of cheerfulness abroad, that the clearest summer air and brightest summer sun might have endeavored to diffuse in vain.
For the people who were shoveling away on the housetops were jovial and full of glee, calling out to one another from the parapets, and now and then exchanging a facetious snowball, better-natured missile far than many a wordy jest, laughing heartily, if it went right, and not less heartily if it went wrong. The poulterers' shops were still half open, and the fruiterers were radiant in their glory. They were great, round, pot-bellied baskets of chestnuts, shaped like their waistcoats of jolly green gentlemen, lolling at the doors and tumbling out into the streets.
The grocers! Oh, the grocers! Nearly closed, with perhaps 2 shutters down, or 1, but through those gaps such glimpses. It was not alone that the scales descending on the counter made a merry sound, and that the twine and roller parted company so briskly, or that the canisters were rattled up and down like juggling tricks, or even that the blended scent of tea and coffee were so grateful to the nose, or even that the raisins were so plentiful and rare, the almonds so extremely white, the sticks of cinnamon so long and straight, the other spices so delicious, the candied fruit so caked and spouted with molten sugar as to make the coldest lookers-on feel faint and subsequently bilious. Nor was it that the figs were moist and plumpy, or that the French plums blushed in modest tartness from their highly decorated boxes, or that everything was good to eat and in its Christmas dress, but the customers were all so hurried and so eager in the hopeful promise of the day that they tumbled up against each other at the door, clashing their wicker baskets wildly, and left their purchases upon the counter, and came running back to fetch them.
But soon the steeples called good people all to church and chapel, and away they came, flocking through the streets in their best clothes and with their gayest faces. And at the same time there emerged from scores of by-streets, lanes, and nameless turnings innumerable people carrying their dinners to the bakers' shops. The sight of these poor revelers appeared to the interest of the spirit very much, for he stood with Scrooge beside him in the baker's doorway, and taking off the covers as their bearers passed, sprinkled incense on their dinners from his torch. And it was a very uncommon kind of torch, for once or twice, when there were angry words between some dinner carriers who had jostled each other, he shed a few drops of water on them from it, and their good humor was restored directly, for they said it was a shame to quarrel upon Christmas Day, and so it was. God love it, so it was.
Is there a peculiar flavor in what you sprinkle from your torch?
There is, my own.
Would it apply to any kind of dinner on this day?
To any kindly given, to a poor one most.
Why the poor one most?
Because it needs it most.
Spirit, I wonder if all the beings in the many worlds about us should desire to cramp these people's opportunities of innocent enjoyment.
Aye.
You would deprive them of their means of dining every seventh day, often the only day which they can find anything to dine on at all, wouldn't you?
Aye.
You seek to close these places on the seventh day, and it comes to the same thing.
I seek.
Forgive me if I was wrong. It has been done in your name, or at least in that of your family.
There are some upon this earth of yours who lay claim to know us, and who do their deeds of passion, pride, ill will, hatred, envy, bigotry, and selfishness in our name, who are as strange to us and all our kith and kin as if they had never lived. Remember that, and charge their doings on themselves, not us.
Scrooge promised that he would, and they went on, invisible, as they had been before, into the suburbs of the town. It was a remarkable quality of the ghost that, notwithstanding his gigantic size, he could accommodate himself to any place with ease, and that he stood beneath a low roof quite as gracefully and like a supernatural creature as it was possible he could have done in any lofty hall.
And perhaps it was the pleasure the good spirit had in showing off this power of his, or else it was his own kind, generous, hearty nature, and his sympathy with all poor men, that led him straight to Scrooge's clerk. For there he went and took Scrooge with him, holding to his robe, and on the threshold of the door the spirit smiled and stopped to bless Bob Cratchit's dwelling with a sprinkling of his torch.
Then up rose Mrs. Cratchit, Cratchit's wife, dressed out but poorly in a twice-turned gown, but brave in ribbons, which are cheap and make a goodly show for 6 pence. And she laid the cloth, assisted by Belinda Cratchit, second of her daughters, also brave in ribbons, while Master Peter Cratchit plunged a fork into the saucepan of potatoes, and getting the corner of his monstrous shirt-collar, Bob's private property, conferred upon his son and heir in the honor of the day, into his mouth, rejoiced to find himself so gallantly attired, and yearned to show his linen in the fashionable parks. And now 2 smaller Cratchits, boy and girl, came tearing in, screaming that outside the bakery they'd smelled the goose, and known it for their own, and basking in the luxurious thoughts of sage and onion. These Cratchits danced about the table.
What has ever got your precious father, then? And your brother, Tiny Tim? And Martha weren't as late last Christmas Day by half an hour?
Here's Martha, Mother.
Hurrah!
Here's Martha.
There's such a goose, Martha.
Why, bless your hearts alive, my dear, how late you are.
We had a deal of work to finish up last night. I had to clear away this morning.
Well, never mind, so long as you are come. Sit ye down before the fire, my dear, and have a warm, Lord bless ye. No, there's father coming. Hide, Martha, hide.
So Martha hid herself, and in came little Bob, the father, with at least 3 feet of comforter exclusive of the fringe, hanging down before him, and his threadbare clothes darned up and brushed to look seasonable, and Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Alas, for Tiny Tim, he bore a little crutch, and had his limbs supported by an iron frame.
Why? Where's our Martha?
Not coming.
Not coming? Not coming upon Christmas Day?
Martha didn't like to see him disappointed, if it were only a joke, so she came out prematurely from behind the closet door and ran into his arms, while the two young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim and bore him off to the wash-house, that he might hear the pudding singing in the copper.
And how did little Tiny Tim behave?
As good as gold and better. Somehow he gets thoughtful sitting by himself so much, and thinks the strangest things you ever heard. He told me, coming home, that he hoped that people saw him in church because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant to them to remember upon Christmas Day who made lame beggars walk and blind men see. Tiny Tim is growing strong and hearty.
His active little crutch was heard upon the floor, and back came Tiny Tim before another word was spoken, escorted by his brother and sister to his stool by the fire. Then Master Peter and the two ubiquitous young Cratchits went to fetch the goose, with which they soon returned in high procession. Such a bustle ensued that you might have thought a goose was the rarest of all birds, a feathered phenomenon to which a black swan was a matter of course. And, in truth, it was something very like it in that house. Mrs. Cratchit made the gravy, ready beforehand in a little saucepan, hissing hot. Master Peter mashed the potatoes with incredible vigor. Miss Belinda sweetened up the applesauce. Martha dusted the hot plates. Bob took Tiny Tim beside him in a tiny corner at the table. The two young Cratchits set chairs for everybody, not forgetting themselves, and mounting guard upon their post, crammed spoons into their mouths, lest they should shriek for goose before their turn came to be helped. At last the dishes were set on, and grace was said, looking slowly all along the carving knife, prepared to plunge it into the breast. But when she did, and when the long-expected gush of stuffing issued forth, one murmur of delight rose all around the board, and even Tiny Tim, excited by the two young Cratchits, beat on the table with the handle of his knife, and feebly cried, "Hurrah!"
There never was such a goose. Bob said he didn't believe there ever was such a goose cooked. Its tenderness and flavor, size, and cheapness were the themes of universal admiration, eked out by applesauce and mashed potatoes. It was a sufficient dinner for the whole family. Indeed, as Mrs. Cratchit said with great delight, surveying one small atom of a bone upon the dish, they hadn't ate it all at last. Yet every one had had enough, and the youngest Cratchits in particular were steeped in sage and onion to the eyebrows. But now, the plates being changed by Miss Belinda, Mrs. Cratchit left the room alone, too nervous to bear witness, to take the pudding up and bring it in. Suppose it should not be done enough? Suppose it should break the turning out? Suppose somebody should have got over the wall of the backyard and stolen it? While they were very merry with the goose, a supposition at which two young Cratchits became livid. All sorts of horrors were supposed.
Hallo! A great deal of steam. The pudding was out of the copper. A smell like a washing day. That was the cloth. A smell like an eating house and a pastry cook's next door to each other, with a laundress next door to that. That was the pudding. In half a minute Miss Cratchit entered, flushed but smiling proudly, with the pudding, like a speckled cannonball, so hard and firm, blazing in half of a quartern of ignited brandy, and bedight with Christmas holly stuck into the top.
Oh, a wonderful pudding! This is the greatest success achieved by Mrs. Cratchit since our marriage.
I had my doubts about the quantity of flour.
Everybody had something to say about it, but nobody said or thought it was a small pudding for a large family. It would have been flat heresy to do so. Any Cratchit would have blushed a hint at such a thing.
At last the dinner was all done. The cloth was cleared and the hearth swept, and the fire made up. The compound in the jug being tasted and considered perfect, apples and oranges were put upon the table. Then all the Cratchit family drew around the hearth, in what Bob Cratchit called a circle, meaning half of one, and at Bob Cratchit's elbow stood the family display of glass, 2 tumblers and a custard cup without a handle.
These held the hot stuff from the jug. However, as well as the golden goblets would have done, and Bob served it with beaming looks while the chestnuts on the fire sputtered and cracked noisily. Then Bob proposed,
"A Merry Christmas to all of us, my dears. God bless us."
God bless us, everyone.
He sat very close to his father's side upon his little stool. Bob held his withered little hand in his, as if he loved the child and wished to keep him by his side, and dreaded that he might be taken from him.
Spirit, tell me, will Tiny Tim live?
I see a vacant seat in the poor chimney corner, and a crutch without an owner, carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die.
No, kind spirit. Say he will be spared.
If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, none other of my race will find him here. What then? If he'd be like to die, he'd better do it, and decrease the surplus population.
Scrooge hung his head to hear his own words quoted by the spirit, and was overcome with penitence and grief.
Man, if man you be in your heart, forbear that wicked cant until you have discovered what the surplus is and where it is. Will you decide what men shall live and what men shall die? It may be that in the sight of heaven you are more worthless and less fit to live than millions like this poor man's child. Oh God, to hear the insect on the leaf pronouncing on the too much life among his hungry brothers in the dust.
Scrooge bent before the ghost's rebuke, and trembling cast his eyes upon the ground, but he raised them speedily on hearing his own name.
"Mr. Scrooge! I'll give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast."
The founder of the feast, indeed. I wish I had him here. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast upon, and I hope he'd have a good appetite for it.
My dear, the children. Christmas Day.
It should be Christmas Day, I'm sure, on which one drinks the health of such an odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man as Mr. Scrooge. You know he is, Robert. Nobody knows it better than you do, poor fellow.
My dear, Christmas Day.
I'll drink his health for your sake in the days, not for his. Long life to him. A Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. He'll be very merry and very happy, I have no doubt.
The children drank the toast after her. It was the first of their proceedings which had no heartiness. Tiny Tim drank it last of all, but he didn't care twopence for it. Scrooge was the ogre of the family. The mention of his name cast a dark shadow on the party, which was not dispelled for full 5 minutes.
After it had passed away, they were 10 times merrier than before. From the mere relief of Scrooge, the baleful, being done with, Bob Cratchit told them how he had a situation in his eye for Master Peter, which would bring in, if obtained, full 5 and 6 pence weekly. The 2 young Cratchits laughed tremendously at the idea of Peter's being a man of business, and Peter himself looked thoughtfully at the fire from between his collars, as if he were deliberating what particular investments he should favor when he came into the receipt of that bewildering income. Martha, who was a poor apprentice at a milliner's, then told them what kind of work she had to do, and how many hours she worked at a stretch, and how she meant to lie abed tomorrow morning for a good long rest. Tomorrow being a holiday, she passed at home. Also how she had seen a countess and a lord some days before, and how the lord was much about as tall as Peter, at which Peter pulled up his collars so high that you couldn't have seen his head if you had been there. All this time the chestnuts and the jug went around and round, and by they had a song about a lost child traveling in the snow, from Tiny Tim, who had a plaintive little voice, and sang it very well indeed.
They were happy, grateful, pleased with one another, and contented with the time. And when they faded, and looked happier yet in the bright sprinklings of the spirit's torch at parting, Scrooge had his eye upon them, and especially on Tiny Tim, until the last.
By this time it was getting dark and snowing pretty heavily, and as Scrooge and the spirit went along the streets, the brightness of the roaring fires in kitchens, parlors, and all sorts of rooms was wonderful. Here the flickering of the blaze showed preparations for a cozy dinner, with hot plates baking through and through before the fire, and deep red curtains ready to be drawn to shut out the cold and darkness. There all the children of the house were running out into the snow to meet their married sisters, brothers, cousins, uncles, aunts, and be the first to greet them. Here again were shadows on the window blind of guests assembling, and there a group of handsome girls, all hooded and fur-booted, and all chattering at once, tripped lightly off to some near neighbor's house, where, woe upon the single man who saw them enter, artful witches, well they knew it, in a glow.
But if you had judged from the numbers of people on their way to friendly gatherings, you might have thought that no one was home to give them welcome when they got there. Instead of every house expecting company and piling up its fires half chimney high, blessings on it! The ghost exulted, floated on, outpouring with a generous hand its bright and harmless mirth on everything within its reach. The very lamplighter who ran on before, dotting the dusky streets with specks of light, and who was dressed to spend the evening elsewhere, laughed out loudly as the spirit passed, though little kenned the lamplighter that he had any company but Christmas.
And now, without a word of warning from the ghost, they stood upon a bleak and desert moor, where monstrous masses of rude stone were cast about, and though it were the burial place of giants, and water spread itself wherever so it listed, or would have done so, but for the frost that held it prisoner, and nothing grew but moss and furze, and coarse rank grass. Down in the west the setting sun had left a streak of fiery red, which glared upon the desolation for an instant, like a sullen eye, and frowning lower, lower yet, was lost in the thick gloom of darkest night.
What place is this?
A place where miners live, who labor in the bowels of the earth. But they know me. See.
A light shone from the window of a hut, and swiftly they advanced toward it. Passing through the wall of mud and stone, they found a cheerful company assembled round a glowing fire. An old woman, old man and woman, and their children, and their children's children, and another generation beyond that, all decked out gaily in their holiday attire. The old man, in a voice that seldom rose above the howling of the wind upon the barren waste, was singing them a Christmas song. It had been a very old song when he was a boy, and from time to time they all joined in the chorus. So surely they had raised their voices, the old man not quite blithe and loud, and surely, as they stopped, his vigor sank again. The spirit did not tarry here, but bade Scrooge hold his robe, and passing above the moor, sped, whither, not to see. To see. To Scrooge's horror, looking back, he saw the last of the land, a frightful range of rocks behind them, and his ears were deafened by the thundering of water, as it rolled and roared, and raged among the dreadful caverns it had worn, and fiercely tried to undermine the earth.
Built upon a dismal reef of sunken rocks, some league or so from shore, on which the waters chafed and dashed the wild year through, there stood a solitary lighthouse. Great heaps of seaweed clung to its base, and storm birds, born of the wind, one might suppose, as seaweed of the water, rose and fell about it, like the waves they skimmed.
But even here 2 men who watched the light had made a fire, that through the loophole in the thick stone wall shed out a ray of brightness on the awful sea. Joining their horny hands over the rough table at which they sat, they wished each other Merry Christmas in their can of grog. And one of them, the elder too, with his face all damaged and scarred with hard weather, as the figurehead of an old ship might be, struck up a sturdy song that was like a gale in itself.
Again the ghost sped on, above the black and heaving sea. On, until being far away, as he told Scrooge, from any shore, they lighted on a ship. They stood beside the helmsman at the wheel, the lookout in the bow, the officers who had the watch, dark, ghostly figures in several stations, but every man among them hummed a Christmas tune, or had a Christmas thought, or spoke below his breath to his companion of some bygone Christmas day with homeward hopes belonging to it. And every man on board, waking or sleeping, good or bad, had a kinder word for another on that day than on any day in the year, and had shared some extent in its festivities, and had remembered those he cared for at a distance, and had known that they delighted to remember him.
It was a great surprise to Scrooge, while listening to the moaning of the wind, and thinking what a solemn thing it was to move on through the lonely darkness over an unknown abyss, whose depths were secrets as profound as death. It was a great surprise to Scrooge, while thus engaged, to hear a hearty laugh. It was a much greater surprise to Scrooge to recognize it as his own nephew's, and to find himself in a bright day, gleaming room, with the Spirit standing smiling by his side, and looking at the same nephew with approving affability.
If you should happen, by any unlikely chance, to know a man more blessed in a laugh than Scrooge's nephew, all I can say is, I should like to know him too. Introduce him to me, and I'll cultivate his acquaintance.
It is a fair, even-handed, noble adjustment of things, that while there is infection in disease and sorrow, there is nothing in the world so irresistibly contagious as laughter and good humor. When Scrooge's nephew laughed in this way, holding his sides, rolling his head, and twisting his face into the most extravagant contortions, Scrooge's niece, by marriage, laughed as heartily as he, and their assembled friends, being not a bit behindhand, roared out lustily.
He said that Christmas was a humbug, as I lived, and he believed it too.
More shame for him, Fred.
She was very pretty, exceedingly pretty, with a dimpled, surprised-looking, capital face, a ripe little mouth that seemed made to be kissed, as no doubt it was. All kinds of good little dots about her chin that melted into one another when she laughed, and the sunniest pair of eyes you ever saw in a little creature's head, although she was what you would have called provoking, you know, but satisfactory, too. Oh, perfectly satisfactory.
He's a comical old fellow, that's the truth, and not so pleasant as he might be. However, his offenses carry their own punishment, and I have nothing to say against him.
I'm sure he's very rich, Fred. At least you'll always tell me so.
What of that, my dear? His wealth is of no use to him. He don't do any good with it. He don't make himself comfortable with it. He hasn't the satisfaction of thinking that he is ever going to benefit us with it.
I have no patience with him.
Oh, I have. I am sorry for him. I couldn't be angry with him if I tried. Who suffers by his ill whims? Himself. Always. Here he takes it to his head to dislike us, and he won't come and dine with us. What's the consequence? He don't lose much of a dinner.
Indeed, I think he loses a very good dinner.
Everybody else said the same, and they must be allowed to have been competent judges, because they had just had dinner, with dessert upon the table, were clustered round the fire by lamplight.
Well, I'm very glad to hear it, because I haven't great faith in these young housekeepers. What do you say, Topper?
Topper had clearly got his eye upon one of Scrooge's niece's sisters, for he answered that a bachelor was a wretched outcast, who had no right to express an opinion on the subject, whereat Scrooge's niece's sister, the plump one with the lace tucker, not the one with the roses, blushed.
Do go on, Fred. He never finishes what he begins to say. He is such a ridiculous fellow.
I was only going to say that the consequence of his taking a dislike to us and not making merry with us is, as I think, that he loses some pleasant moments which could do him no harm. I mean to give him the same chance every year, whether he likes it or not, for I pity him. He may rail at Christmas till he dies, but he can't help thinking better of it. I defy him if he finds me going there in good temper year after year and saying, "Uncle Scrooge, how are you?" If it only puts him in the vein to leave his poor clerk £50, that's something. And I think I shook him yesterday.
It was their turn to laugh now at the notion of his shaking Scrooge. But being thoroughly good-natured and not much caring what they laughed at, so that they laughed at any rate, he encouraged them in their merriment and passed the bottle joyously.
After tea they had some music, for they were a musical family and knew what they were about when they sung a glee or a catch. I can assure you, especially Topper, who could growl away in the bass like a good one, and never swell the large veins in his forehead or get red in the face over it. Scrooge's niece played well upon the harp, and played among other tunes a simple little air, a mere nothing you might learn to whistle in 2 minutes, which had been familiar to the child who fetched Scrooge from the boarding school, as he had been reminded by the ghost of Christmas past. When this strain of music sounded, all the things that ghosts had shown him came upon his mind. He softened more and more, and thought that if he could have listened to it often years ago, he might have cultivated the kindness of life for his own happiness with his own hands, without resorting to the sexton's spade that buried Jacob Marley.
They didn't devote the whole evening to music. After a while they played at forfeits. For it is good to be children sometimes, and never better than at Christmas, when its mighty founder was a child himself. Stop. There was first a game at Blind Man's Buff. Of course there was. And I no more believe Topper was really blind than I believe he had eyes in his boots. My opinion is that it was a done thing between him and Scrooge's nephew, and that the ghost of Christmas Present knew it. The way he went after that plump sister in the lace tucker was an outrage on the credulity of human nature. Knocking down the fire irons, tumbling over the chairs, bumping against the piano, smothering himself amongst the curtains, there went he. He always knew where the plump sister was. He wouldn't catch anybody else. If you had fallen up against him, as some of them did, on purpose, he would have made a feint in endeavoring to seize you, which would have been an affront to your understanding, and would instantly have sidled off in the direction of the plump sister. She often cried out that it wasn't fair, and it really was not. But when at last he caught her, when in spite of all her silken rustles and her rapid fluttering past him, he got her into a corner whence there was no escape, then his conduct was most execrable. For this pretending not to know her, his pretending that it was necessary to touch her headdress, and further to assure himself of her identity by pressing a certain ring upon her finger, and a certain chain about her neck, was vile, monstrous. No doubt she told him her opinion of it, when another blind man being in office, they were so very confidential together, behind the curtains.
Scrooge's niece was not one of the Blind Men's Buff party, but was made comfortable with a large chair and a footstool in a snug corner, where the ghost and Scrooge were close behind her. But she joined in the forfeit, and loved her love to admiration with all the letters of the alphabet. Likewise, at the game of how, when, and where, she was very great, and to the secret joy of Scrooge's nephew, beat her sister hollow, though there were sharp girls, too, as could have told you. There might have been 20 people there, young and old, but they all played, and so did Scrooge.
The ghost was greatly pleased to find him in this mood, and looked upon him with such favor that he begged like a little boy to be allowed to stay until the guests departed. But this, the spirit said, could not be done.
Here's a new game. 1/2 hour, spirit, only one.
It was a game called Yes and No, where Scrooge's nephew had to think of something, and the rest must find out what. He only answering to their question yes or no, as the case was. The brisk fire of questioning to which he was exposed elicited from him that he was thinking of an animal, a live animal rather, a disagreeable animal, a savage animal, an animal that growled and grunted sometimes, and talked sometimes, and lived in London, and walked about the streets, and wasn't made a show of, and wasn't led by anybody, and didn't live in a menagerie, as was never killed in a market, and was not a horse, or an ass, or a cow, or a bull, or a tiger, or a dog, or a pig, or a cat, or a bear. At every fresh question that was put to him, this nephew burst into a fresh roar of laughter, and was inexpressibly tickled that he was obliged to get up off the sofa and stamp.
I have found it out. I know what it is, Fred. I know what it is.
What is it?
It's our Uncle Scrooge.
He has given us plenty of merriment, I am sure, and it would be ungrateful not to drink to his health. Here is a glass of mulled wine ready to our hand at the moment, and I say, Uncle Scrooge!
Well, Uncle Scrooge.
Uncle Scrooge! A Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to the old man, whatever he is. He wouldn't take it from me, but may have it nevertheless. Uncle Scrooge!
Uncle Scrooge had imperceptibly become so gay and light of heart that he would have pledged the unconscious company in return, and thanked them in an inaudible speech if the ghost had given him time. But the whole scene passed off in breath of the last words spoken by his nephew, and he and the spirit were again up to their travels.
Much they saw, and far they went, and many homes they visited, but always with a happy end. The spirit stood beside sick beds, and they were cheerful, on foreign lands, and they were close at home, by struggling men, and they were patient in their greater hope, by poverty, and it was rich. In almshouse, hospital, and jail, in misery's every refuge, where vain men in his little brief authority had not made fast the door and barred the spirit out, he left his blessing and taught Scrooge his precepts.
It was a long night, if it were only night, but Scrooge had his doubts of this, because the Christmas holidays appeared to be condensed into the space of time they passed together. It was strange, too, that while Scrooge remained unaltered in his outward form, the ghost grew older, clearly older. Scrooge had observed this change, but never spoke of it, until they left the children's 12th night party, when looking at the spirit and they stood together in an open place, he noticed that its hair was gray.
Are spirits' lives so short?
My life upon this globe is very brief. It ends tonight.
Tonight?
Tonight at midnight. Hark! The time is drawing near.
Forgive me if I am not justified what I ask, but I see something strange and not belonging to yourself protruding from your skirts. Is it a foot or a claw?
It might be a claw, for the flesh there is upon it. Look here.
From the foldings of its robe, it brought 2 children, wretched, abject, frightful, hideous, miserable. They knelt down at its feet and clung upon the outside of its garment.
Oh, man, look here. Look down here.
They were a boy and a girl, yellow, meager, ragged, scowling, wolfish, but prostrate, too, in their humility, where graceful youth should have filled their features out and touched them with its freshest tints. A stale and shriveled hand, like that of age, had pinched and twisted them and pulled them into shreds. Where angels might have sat enthroned, devils lurked and glared out menacing. No change, no degradation, no perversion of humanity in any grade through all the mysteries of wonderful creation has monsters half so horrible and dread.
Scrooge started back, appalled, having them shown to him in this way. He tried to say they were fine children, but the words choked themselves, rather than be parties to a lie of such enormous magnitude.
Spirit, are they yours?
They are man's, and they cling to me appealing from their fathers. This boy is ignorance, this girl is want. Beware of them both, and all of their degree, but most of all beware this boy, for on his brow I see that written which is doom, unless the writing be erased. Deny it! Slander those who tell it ye. Admit it for your factious purposes, and make it worse, and abide the end.
Have they no refuge or resource?
Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses?
Scrooge looked about him for the ghost, and saw it not. As the last stroke ceased to vibrate, he remembered the prediction of old Jacob Marley, and lifting up his eyes beheld a solemn phantom, draped and hooded, coming like a mist along the ground towards him.
Stave 4, the last of the spirits. The phantom slowly, gravely, silently approached. When it came, Scrooge bent down upon his knee, for in the very air through which the spirit moved, it seemed to scatter gloom and mystery.
It was shrouded in a deep black garment, which concealed its head, its face, its form, and left nothing of it visible save one outstretched hand. But for this, it would have been difficult to detach its figure from the night, and separate it from the darkness which it was surrounded.
He felt that it was tall and stately when it came beside him, and that its mysterious presence filled him with a solemn dread. He knew no more, for the spirit neither spoke nor moved.
Am I in the presence of the ghost of Christmas yet to come?
The spirit answered not, but pointed downward with his hand.
You are about to show me the shadows of the things that have not happened, but will happen in the time before us. Is that so, spirits?
The upper portion of the garment was contracted for an instant in its folds, as if the spirit had inclined its head. That was the only answer he received.
Although well used to ghostly company by this time, Scrooge feared the silent shape so much that his legs trembled beneath him, and he found that he could hardly stand when he prepared to follow it. The spirit pauses a moment, as observing his condition and giving him time to recover.
But Scrooge was all the worse for this. It thrilled him with a vague, uncertain horror to know that behind the dusky shroud there were ghostly eyes intently fixed upon him, while he, though he stretched his own to the utmost, could see nothing but a spectral hand and one great heap of black.
A ghost of the future. I fear you more than any spectre I have seen, but as I know your purpose is to do me good, and as I hope to live to be another man from what I was, I am prepared to bear you company and do it with a thankful heart. Will you not speak to me?
It gave him no reply. The hand was pointed straight before them.
Lead on. Lead on. The night is waning fast, and it is precious time to me, I know. Lead on, spirit.
The phantom moved away as it had come toward Scrooge. Scrooge followed in the shadow of its dress, which bore him up.
They scarcely seemed to enter the city, for the city rather seemed to spring up about them and encompass them of its own act. But there they were, in the heart of it, on change amongst the merchants who hurried up and down and chinked the money in their pockets, and conversed in groups, and looked at their watches and trifled thoughtfully with their great gold seals, and so forth, as Scrooge had seen them often.
The spirit stopped beside one little knot of businessmen. Observing that the hand was pointed to them, Scrooge advanced to listen to their talk.
No, I don't know much about it either way. I only know he's dead.
When did he die?
Last night, I believe.
Why? What was the matter with him? I thought he'd never die.
Oh, God knows.
What has he done with his money?
Asked a red-faced gentleman with a pendulous excrescence on the end of his nose that shook like the gills of a turkey-cock.
Well, I haven't heard. Left it to his company, perhaps. He hasn't left it to me. That's all I know.
It's likely to be a very cheap funeral. For upon my life, I don't know anyone that would go to it. Suppose we make up a party and volunteer.
I don't mind going if lunch is provided.
Observe the gentleman with the excrescence on his nose.
But I must be fed if I make one.
Well, I am the most disinterested among you after all, for I never wear black gloves, and I never eat lunch. But I'll offer to go if anybody else will. When I come to think of it, I'm not all sure that I wasn't his most particular friend, for we used to stop and speak whenever we met. Bye-bye.
Speakers and listeners strolled away and mixed with other groups. Scrooge knew the men and looked towards the spirit for an explanation.
The phantom glided on into a street. His finger pointed to two persons meeting. Scrooge listened again, thinking that the explanation might lie here.
He knew these men also perfectly. They were men of high business, very wealthy and of great importance. He had made a point always of standing well in their esteem. In a business point of view, that is. Strictly in a business point of view.
How are you?
Oh, how are you?
Well, old Scratch has got his own key at last, eh?
I'm told. Cold, isn't it?
Seasonable for Christmas time. You're not a skater, I suppose?
Oh, no. Something else to think of. Good morning.
Not another word. That was their meeting, their conversation, and their parting.
Scrooge was at first inclined to be surprised that the spirit should attach importance to this conversation, apparently so trivial. But feeling assured that they must have had some hidden purpose, he resolved to treasure up every word he heard and everything that he saw, and especially to observe the shadow of himself when it appeared. For he had an expectation that the conduct of his future self would give him the clue he missed, and would render the solution of these riddles easy.
He looked about in that very place for his own image, but another man stood in his accustomed corner, and though the clock pointed to the usual time of day for being there, he saw no likeness of himself among the multitudes that poured in through the porch. It gave him little surprise, however, that he had been revolving in his mind a change of life, and thought and hoped he saw his newborn resolutions carried out in this.
Quiet and dark, beside him stood the phantom, with its outstretched hand. When he roused himself from his thoughtful quest, he fancied from the turn of the hand, and its situation in reference to him, that the unseen eyes were looking at him keenly. It made him shudder and feel very cold.
They left the busy scene and went into an obscure part of town where Scrooge had never penetrated before, although he recognized its situation and its bad repute. The ways were foul and narrow, the shops and houses wretched, the people half naked, drunken, slipshod, ugly. Alleys and archways, like so many cesspools, disgorged with the offenses of smell and dirt and life. Upon the straggling streets, and the whole quarter reeked with crime and filth and misery.
Far in this den of infamous resort, there was a low-browed, beetling shop below the penthouse roof, where iron, old rags, bottles, bones, and a greasy offal were bought. Upon the floor within were piled heaps of rusty keys, nails, chains, hinges, files, scales, weights, and refuse iron of all kinds. Sitting in among the wares he dealt in, by the charcoal stove made of old bricks, was a gray-haired rascal, nearly 70 years of age, who had screened himself from the cold air without by a frowsy curtaining of miscellaneous tatters, hung upon a line, and smoked his pipe in all the luxury of calm retirement.
Scrooge and the Phantom came into the presence of this man, just as a woman with a heavy bundle slunk into the shop. But she had scarcely entered when another woman, similarly laden, came in too, and she was closely followed by a man in faded black, who was no less startled by the sight of them than they'd been upon recognition of each other. After a short period of blank astonishment, in which the old man with the pipe had joined them, they all three burst into a laugh.
Let the old chairwoman be alone to be the first. Let the laundress alone to be the second, and the undertaker's man alone to be the third. Look here, old Joe, here's a chance. If we hadn't all three met here without meaning it.
You couldn't have met me in a better place. Come into the parlor. You were made free of it long ago, you know, and the other two ain't strangers. Stop till I shut the door of the shop. How it squeaks! There ain't such a rusty bit of metal in this place as its own hinges, I believe, and I'm sure there's no such old bones here as mine. We're all suitable to our calling. Well matched. Come into the parlor. Come into the parlor.
The parlor was the space behind the old screen of rags. The old man raked the fire together with an old stair-rod, and having trimmed his smoky lamp, for it was night, with the stem of his pipe, put it in his mouth again.
While he did this, the woman who had already spoken threw her bundle on the floor, and sat down in a flaunting manner on a stool, crossing her elbows on her knees, and looking with a bold defiance at the other two.
What odds, then? What odds, Miss Dilber? Every person has a right to take care of themselves. He always did.
That's true indeed. No man more so.
Why then, don't stand there staring as if you was afraid, woman. Who's the wiser? We're not going to pick holes in each other's coats, I suppose.
No, indeed.
We should hope not.
Very well, then. That's enough. Who's the worse for the loss of a few things like these? Not a dead man, I suppose.
No, indeed. If he wanted to keep them after he was dead, a wicked old screw, why wasn't he natural in his lifetime? If he had been, he'd had somebody to look after him when he was struck with death, instead of lying gasping out his last there alone by himself. It's the truest word that ever was spoke. It's a judgment on him.
I wish it was a little heavier judgment, and it should have been. You may depend upon it. If I could have laid my hands on anything else. Open that bundle, old Joe. Let me know the value of it. Speak out plain. I'm not afraid to be the first, nor afraid for them to see it. We know pretty well that we're helping ourselves before we meet here, I believe. It's no sin. Open the bundle, Joe.
But the gallantry of her friends would not allow of this, and the man in faded black, mounting the breach first, produced his plunder. It was not extensive. A seal or two, a pencil case, a pair of sleeve buttons, and a brooch of no great value were all. They were severally examined and appraised by old Joe, who chalked the sums he was disposed to give each for upon the wall, and added them up into a total when he found there was nothing more to come.
That's your account, and I wouldn't give you another sixpence if I was to be boiled for doing it. Who's next?
Mrs. Dilber was next. Sheets and towels, a little wearing apparel, 2 old-fashioned silver teaspoons, a pair of sugar tongs, and a few boots. Her account was stated on the wall in the same manner.
I always give too much to ladies. It's a weakness of mine, and that's the way I ruin myself. That's your account. If you ask me for another penny, I made it be open question. I repent and be so liberal, and knock off half a crown.
And now undo my bundle, Joe.
Joe went down on his knees for the greater convenience of opening it, and having unfastened a great many knots, dragged out a very large and heavy roll of some dark stuff.
What do you call this? Bed curtains?
Aha! Bed curtains.
You didn't mean to say you took them down, rings and all, with him lying there?
Yes, I do. Why not?
You were born to make your fortune. You'll be certainty to do it.
I certainly shan't hold my hand where I can get anything in it by reaching it out. For the sake of such a man as he was, I promise you, Joe. Don't drop that oil upon the blankets now.
His blankets?
Whose else's do you think? He isn't likely to take cold without them, I dare say.
I hope he didn't die of anything catching, eh?
Don't you be afraid of that. I ain't so fond of his company that I'd loiter about him for such things if he did, You may look through the shirt till your eyes ache, but you won't find a hole in it, nor a threadbare place. It's the best he had, and a fine one, too. They'd have wasted it if it hadn't been for me.
What do you call wasting of it?
Putting on him, to be buried in, to be sure. Somebody was fool enough to do it, but I took it off again. If calico ain't good enough for such a purpose, it isn't good enough for anything. It's quite as becoming to the body. He can't look uglier than he did in that one.
Scrooge listened to this dialogue in horror, as they sat grouped about their spoil in the scanty light afforded by the old man's lamp. He viewed them with a detestation and disgust which could hardly have been greater, though they demons mocketing the corpse itself.
This is the end of it, you see. He frightened everyone away from him when he was alive, to profit us when he was dead.
Spirit, I see. The case of this unhappy man might be my own. My life tends that way now. Merciful heaven, what is this?
He recoiled in terror, for the scene had changed, and now he almost touched a bed, a bare, uncurtained bed, on which, beneath a ragged sheet, there lay something covered up, which, though it was dumb, announced itself in awful language.
The room was very dark, too dark to be observed with any accuracy, though Scrooge glanced round it in obedience to a secret impulse, anxious to know what kind of room it was. A pale light rising in the outer air fell straight upon the bed, and on it, plundered and bereft, unwatched, unwept, uncared for, was the body of this man.
Scrooge glanced toward the phantom. Its steady hand was pointed to the head. The cover was so carelessly adjusted that the slightest raising of it, the motion of a finger upon Scrooge's part, would have disclosed the face. He thought of it, felt how easy it would be to do, and longed to do it, but had no more power to withdraw the veil than to dismiss the spectre at his side.
O cold, cold, rigid, dreadful death, set up thine altar here, and dress it with such terrors as thou hast at thy command, for this is thy dominion. But of the loved, revered, and honored head thou canst not turn one hair to thy dread purpose, or make one feature odious. It is not that the hand is heavy, and will fall down when released. It is not that the heart and pulse are still, but that the hand was open, generous, and true, the heart brave, warm, and tender, the pulse of a man's. Strike, shadow, strike! And see this good deed springing from the wound to sow the world with life immortal.
No voice pronounced these words in Scrooge's ears, and yet he heard them when he looked upon the bed. He thought, if this man could be raised up now, What would be his foremost thoughts? Avarice, hard dealing, gripping cares. They have brought him to a rich end, truly.
He lay in the dark, empty house with not a man, a woman, or a child to say that he was kind to me in this or that, and for the memory of one kind word I would be kind to him. A cat was tearing at the door, and there was a sound of gnawing rats beneath the hearthstone. What they wanted in the room of death, and why they were so restless and disturbed, Scrooge did not dare to think.
Spirit, this is a fearful place. In leaving it, I shall not leave its lesson, trust me. Let us go.
Still, the ghost pointed with an unmoved finger to the head.
I understand you, and I would do it if I could, but I have not the power, Spirit. I have not the power.
Again it seemed to look upon him.
If there is any person in this town who feels emotion caused by this man's death, show that person to me, Spirit, I beseech you.
The phantom spread its dark robe before him for a moment like a wing, and withdrawing it revealed a room by daylight where a mother and child were.
She was expecting someone, and with anxious eagerness, for she walked up and down the room, started at every sound, looked out from the window, glanced at the clock, tried, but in vain, to work with her needle, and could barely hear the voices of children at play.
At length the long-expected knock was heard. She hurried to the door and met her husband, a man whose face was careworn and depressed, though he was young. There was a remarkable expression in it now, a kind of serious delight which he felt ashamed, and which he struggled to repress.
He sat down to dinner that had been boarding for him by the fire, and when she asked him faintly what news, which was not until after a long silence, he appeared embarrassed how to answer.
Is it good or bad?
Bad.
We are quite ruined.
No. There is hope yet, Carolyn.
If he relents, there is. Nothing is past hope if such a miracle has happened.
He is past relenting. He is dead!
She was a mild and patient creature, if her face spoke truth. But she was thankful in her soul to hear it, and she said so. With clasped hands, she prayed forgiveness the next moment, and was sorry. But for the first was the emotion of her heart.
What the half-drunken woman who I told you of last night said to me when I tried to see him and obtain a week's delay, and what I thought was a mere excuse to avoid me, turns out to have been quite true. He was not only very ill, but dying then.
To whom will our debt be transferred?
I don't know. But before that time we shall be ready with the money. And even though we were not, it would be a bad fortune indeed to find so merciless a creditor to his successor. We may sleep tonight with light hearts, Carolyn.
Yes, soften it as they would, their hearts were lighter. The children's faces hushed, and the clustered round to hear what they so little understood were brighter, and it was a happier house for this man's death. The only emotion that the ghost could show him, caused by the event, was one of pleasure.
Let me see some tenderness connected with the death, or that dark chamber, Spirit, which we left just now will forever be present to me.
The ghost conducted him through several streets familiar to his feet, and as they went along, Scrooge looked here and there to find himself, but nowhere was he to be seen. They entered poor Bob Cratchit's house, the dwelling he had visited before, and found the mother and the children seated around the fire.
Quiet. Very quiet. The noisy little Cratchits were as still as statues in one corner, and sat looking up at Peter, who had a book before him. The mother and her daughters were engaged in sewing, but surely they were very quiet.
And he took a child, and set him in the midst of them.
Where had Scrooge heard those words? He had not dreamed them. The boy must have read them out, as he and the spirit crossed the threshold. Why did he not go on? The mother laid her work upon the table, and put her hands up to her face.
Oh, the color hurts my eyes.
Color? Oh, poor Tiny Tim.
They're better now again. It makes them weak by candlelight. I wouldn't show weak eyes to your father when he comes home. For the world, it must be near his time.
Past it, rather. But I think he's walked a little slower than he used to. These few last evenings, Mother.
I have known him to walk with Tiny Tim upon his shoulder, very fast indeed.
And so have I, often.
And so have I. So had all.
But he was very light to carry, and his father loved him so that it was no trouble. And there is your father at the door.
She hurried out to meet him, and little Bob in his comforter, he had no need of it, poor fellow, came in. His tea was ready for him on the hob, and they all tried who should help get it to him the most. Then the two young Cratchits got upon his knees and laid, each child a little cheek against his face.
You went today then, Robert?
Yes, my dear. I wish you could have gone. It would have done you good to see how green a place it is. But you'll see it often. I promised him that I would walk there on Sunday. My little child. My little child.
He broke down all at once. He couldn't help it. If he could have helped it, he and his child would have been farther apart perhaps than they were.
He left the room and went upstairs into the room above, which was lighted cheerfully and hung with Christmas. There was a chair set close beside the child, and there were signs of someone having been there lately. Poor Bob sat down in it, and when he had thought a little and composed himself, he kissed the little face. He was reconciled to what had happened, and went down again quite happy. They drew about the fire and talked, the girls and mother working still.
I saw Mr. Scrooge's nephew on the street today. He was extraordinarily kind. I'm heartily sorry for it, Mr. Cratchit, he said, and heartily sorry for your good wife. And by, how he ever knew that, I don't know.
Knew what, my dear?
Why, that you were a good wife.
Well, everybody knows that.
Very well observed, my boy. I hope they do. Heartily sorry, he said, for your good wife. If I can be of service to you in any way, he said, giving me his card, that's where I live. Pray come to me. Now, it wasn't for the sake of anything he might be able to do for us, so much as for his kind way, that this was quite delightful. I really seemed as if he had known our Tiny Tim and felt with us.
I'm sure he's a good soul.
You would be sure of it, my dear, if you saw and spoke to him. I shouldn't be at all surprised, mark what I say, if he got Peter in a better situation.
Only hear that, Peter.
And then Peter will be keeping company with someone and setting up for himself.
Get along with you.
It's just as likely as not, one of these days, though there's plenty of time for that, my dear. But however, and wherever we part from one another, I'm sure we shall none of us forget poor Tiny Tim. Shall we? Or this first parting that there was among us.
Never, Father.
And I know, my dears, that when we recollect how patient and how mild he was, although he was a little child, we shall not quarrel easily among ourselves, and forget poor Tiny Tim in doing it.
No, never, Father.
I'm very happy.
Mrs. Cratchit kissed him, his daughters kissed him, the two young Cratchits kissed him, and Peter and himself shook hands. Spirit of Tiny Tim, thy childish essence was from God.
Spectre, something informs me that our parting moment is at hand. I know it, but I know not how. Tell me what man that was whom we saw lying dead.
The ghost of Christmas yet to come conveyed him, as before, though at a different time, he thought. Indeed, there seemed no order in these latter visions, save that they were in the future, into the resorts of businessmen, but showed him not himself. Indeed, the spirit did not stay for anything, but went straight on, as to the end just now desired, until besought by Scrooge to tarry for a moment.
This court through which we hurry now is where my place of occupation is, and has been for a length of time. I see the house. Let me behold what I shall be in the days to come.
The spirit stopped. The hand was pointed elsewhere.
The house is yonder. Why do you point away?
The inexorable finger underwent no change.
Scrooge hastened to the window of his office and looked in. It was an office still, but not his. The furniture was not the same, and the figure in the chair was not himself. The phantom pointed as before.
He joined it once again, and wondering why and whither he had gone, accompanied it until they reached an iron gate. He paused to look round before entering.
A churchyard. Here then the wretched man whose name he had now to learn lay underneath the ground. It was a worthy place, walled in by houses, overrun by grass and weeds, the growth of vegetation's death, not life, choked up with too much burying, fat with repleted appetite. A worthy place.
The spirit stood among the graves, and pointed down to one. He advanced towards it, trembling. The phantom was exactly as it had been, but he dreaded that he saw new meaning in its solemn shape.
Before I draw nearer to that stone to which you point, answer me one question. Are these the shadows of things that will be, or are they shadows of things that may be only?
Still the ghost pointed downward to the grave by which it stood.
Men's courses will foreshadow certain ends to which, if persevered in, they must lead. But if the courses be departed from, the ends will change. Say it is thus with what you show me.
Spirit was immovable as ever.
Scrooge crept towards it, trembling as he went, and following the finger, read upon the stone of the neglected grave.
Ebenezer Scrooge, my name! Am I that man that lay upon the bed?
The finger pointed from the grave to him and back again.
No, spirit! Oh, no!
The finger was still there.
Oh, spirits, hear me! I am not the man I was. I would not be the man I must have been, but for this intercourse. Why show me this if I am all but past hope?
For the first time, the hand appeared to shake.
Good spirit, your nature intercedes for me. It pities me. Assure me that I may yet change those shadows which you have shown me by an altered life.
Thine hand trembled.
I will honor Christmas with all my heart. I will keep it all the year. I will live in the past, the present, and the future. Oh, the spirits of all three shall thrive within me. I will not shut out the lessons that they teach. Oh, tell me I may smudge away the writing on this stone.
In his agony he caught the spectral hand. It sought to free itself, but he was strong in his injury, and detained it. The spirit, stronger yet, repulsed him.
Holding up his hands in a last prayer to have his fate reversed, he saw an alteration in the phantom's hood and dress. It shrunk, collapsed, and dwindled down into a bedpost.
Stave 5. The end of it.
Yes, and the bedpost was his own. The bed was his own. The room was his own. Best and happiest of all, the time before him was his own, to make amends in.
I will live in the past, the present, and the future. The spirits of all three shall strive within me. Oh, Jacob Marley, heaven in the Christmas tide be praised for this. I say it on my knees, Jacob, on my knees.
He was so fluttered and so glowing with his good intentions that his broken voice would scarcely answer to his call. He had been sobbing violently in his conflict with the spirit, and his face was wet with tears.
They are not torn down. My bed curtains are not torn down, rings and all. Oh, they are here. I am here. The shadow of the things that have been may be dispelled. They will be. I know they will.
His hands were busy with his garments all this time, turning them inside out, putting them on upside down, tearing them, mislaying them, making them parties for every kind of extravagance.
I don't know what to do. I'm as light as a feather. I'm as happy as an angel. I'm as merry as a schoolboy. I'm as giddy as a drunken man. A Merry Christmas to everybody. A Happy New Year to all the world. Hello there. Whoop. Hello.
Scrooge was laughing and crying in the same breath, and making a perfect raccoon of himself with his stockings. He had frisked into the sitting room, and now was standing there, perfectly winded.
Oh, there's the saucepan the gruel was in. Here's the door by which the ghost of Jacob Marley entered. Oh, There's the corner where the ghost of Christmas present sat. There's the window where I saw the wandering spirits. Oh, it's all right. It's all true. It all happened.
Really, for a man who had been out of practice for so many years, it was a splendid laugh, a most illustrious laugh. A father of a long, long line of brilliant laughs.
I don't know what day of the month it is. I don't know how long I've been among the spirits. Oh, I don't know anything. Oh, I'm quite the baby. Oh, never mind. I don't know. I don't care. I'd rather be a baby. Hello.
Running to the window, he opened it and put out his head. No fog, no mist. Clear, bright, jovial, stirring cold. Cold, piping, for the blood to dance to. Golden sunlight, heavenly sky, sweet fresh air, merry bells.
Oh, glorious, glorious! What's today?
Cried Scrooge, calling downward to a boy in Sunday clothes, who perhaps had loitered in to look about him.
Eh?
What's today, my fine fellow?
Today? Why, Christmas Day.
It's Christmas Day! I haven't missed it. The spirits have done it all in one night. They can do anything they like. Of course they can. Of course they can. Hello there, my fine fellow.
Hello.
Do you know the poulterers in the next street, but one at the corner?
I should hope I did.
Oh, an intelligent boy. A remarkable boy. Do you know whether they sold the prize turkey that was hanging up there? Not the little prize turkey, but the big one.
What? The one as big as me?
Oh, what a delightful boy. It's a pleasure to talk to him. Yes, my buck.
What's hanging there now?
Is it? Go and buy it.
Walker.
No, I am in earnest. Go and buy it and tell them to bring it here, that I may give them the direction where to take it. Come back with the man and I'll give you a shilling. Come back with him in less than 5 minutes, then I'll give you half a crown. I'll send it to Bob Cratchits. He shan't know who sent it. It's twice the size of Tiny Tim.
The hand in which he wrote the address was not a steady one, but write it he did somehow, and went downstairs to open the street door, ready for the coming of the poulterer's men. As he stood there, waiting his arrival, the knocker caught his eye.
I shall love it as long as I live. I scarcely even looked at it before. What an honest expression it has on its face. What a wonderful knocker. Oh, here's the turkey. Hello. Whoop. How are you? Merry Christmas.
Oh, it was a turkey. He never could have stood upon its legs, that bird. He would have snapped them short off in a minute, like sticks of sealing wax.
It's impossible to carry it to Camden Town. You must have a cab.
The chuckle with which he said this, and the chuckle with which he paid for the turkey, and the chuckle with which he paid for the cab, and the chuckle with which he recompensed the boy, were only to be exceeded by the chuckle with which he sat down breathless in his chair again, and chuckled till he cried.
Shaving was not an easy task, for his hand continued to shake very much, and shaving requires attention even when you don't dance while you are at it. But if he had cut the end of his nose off, he would have had to put a piece of sticking plaster over it, and been quite satisfied.
He dressed himself all in his best, and at last got out into the streets. The people were by this time pouring forth, as he had seen them with the ghost of Christmas present, and walking with his hands behind him, Scrooge regarded every one with a delighted smile. He looked so irresistibly pleasant, in a word, that 3 or 4 good-humored fellows said,
"Good morning, sir. A Merry Christmas to you."
Scrooge said often afterwards that all of the blithe sounds he had ever heard, those were the blithest in his ears.
He had not gone far when, coming on towards him, he beheld the portly gentleman who had walked into his counting-house the day before and said, "Scrooge and Marley's, I believe." I sit a pang across his heart to think how this old gentleman would look upon him when they met, but he knew what path lay straight before them, and took it.
My dear sir, how do you do? I hope you succeeded yesterday. It was very kind of you. A Merry Christmas to you, sir.
Mr. Scrooge?
Yes, that is my name, and I fear it may not be pleasant to you. Allow me to ask your pardon, but will you have the goodness of accepting that?
Oh, Lord bless me! My dear Mr. Scrooge, are you serious?
If you please, and not a farthing less. A great many back payments are included in it, I assure you. Will you do me that favor?
My dear sir, I don't know what to say to such munificence.
Don't say anything, please.
Come and see me. Will you please come and see me?
I will.
Thank you. I am much obliged to you. Thank you 50 times. Bless you.
He went to church and walked about the streets and watched the people hurrying to and fro and patted children on the head and questioned beggars and looked down into the kitchens of houses and up to the windows and found that everything could yield him pleasure. He had never dreamed that any walk, that anything, could give him so much happiness. In the afternoon, he turned his steps toward his nephew's house.
He passed the door a dozen times before he had the courage to go up and knock. But he made a dash and did it.
Is your master at home, my dear?
Yes, sir.
Where is he, my love?
He's in the dining room, sir, along with mistress. I'll show you upstairs, if you please.
Oh, thank you. He knows me. I'll be in here, my dear.
He turned it gently and sidled his face in round the door. They were looking at the table, which was spread out in great array. For these young housekeepers are always nervous on such points, and like to see that everything is right.
Fred?
Dear heart alive, how his niece by marriage started. Scrooge had forgotten for the moment about her sitting in the corner with a footstool, or he wouldn't have done it on any account.
Why, bless my soul. Who's that?
It's I, your Uncle Scrooge. I've come for dinner. Will you let me in, Fred?
Let him in. It is a mercy he didn't shake his arm off. He was at home in 5 minutes. Nothing could be heartier. His niece looked just the same. So did Topper when he came. So did the plump sister when she came. So did every one when they came. Wonderful party, wonderful games, wonderful unanimity, wonderful happiness.
But he was early at the office next morning. Oh, he was early there. If he could only be there first and catch Bob Cratchit coming late. That was the thing he had set his heart upon.
And he did it. Yes, he did. The clock struck 9. No Bob. 1:15. No Bob. He was a full 18 minutes and a half behind his time. Scrooge sat with the door wide open, and he might see him come into the tank.
His hat was off before he opened the door. His comforter, too. He was on his stool in a jiffy, driving away with his pen as if he were trying to overtake 9 o'clock.
Hello. What do you mean by coming here at this time of day?
I'm very sorry, sir. I am but behind my time.
You are, yes. I think you are. Step this way, please.
It's only once a year, sir. It shall not be repeated. I was making rather merry yesterday.
Now, I'll tell you what, my friend. I am not going to stand this sort of thing any longer, and therefore... I am about to raise your salary.
With that, Scrooge leapt from his stool, and giving Bob such a dig in the waistcoat that he staggered back into his chair again.
Bob trembled and got a little nearer to the ruler. He had a momentary idea of knocking Scrooge down with it, holding him, and calling to the people in the court for help and a strait waistcoat.
A Merry Christmas, Bob! A merrier Christmas, my good fellow, than I have ever given you in many years. I'll raise your salary and endeavor to assist your struggling family, and we will discuss your affairs this very afternoon, and over a Christmas bowl of smoking bishop, Bob. We'll make up the fires and buy another coal scuttle before you dot another I, Bob Cratchit.
Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all and infinitely more. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father.
He became as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a man as the good old city knew.
Or any other good old city, town, or borough in the good old world. Some people laughed to see the alteration in him, but he let them laugh and little heeded them.
For he was wise enough to know that nothing ever happened on this globe for good at which some people did not have their fill of laughter in the outset. And knowing that such as these would be blind anyway, he thought it quite as well that they should wrinkle up their eyes and grins, as have the malady in less attractive forms.
His own heart laughed, and that was quite enough for him.
He had no further intercourse with the spirits, but lived upon the total abstinence principle ever afterwards. And it was always said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas well, if any man alive possessed the knowledge.
May that be truly said of us, and of all of us. And so, as Tiny Tim observed,
God bless us, everyone.
Thank you very much for joining us on today's very special Allegro Music Podcast. It's part 2 of the Charles Dickens Christmas Classic, A Christmas Carol, performed by the Inland Stage Company. And from all of us here at Allegro Music Podcast, we'd like to remind you to log on to www.allegromusicvenue.com and become a member. Subscribe, support music and music education. Also support these guys here at the Inland Stage Company by logging onto their website. You can link it from our podcast at www.allegromusic.podbean.com. And from all of us here at the Allegro Music Venue and Allegro Music Podcast, we'd like to wish you a very Merry Christmas and bid you adieu.